one of the things that we talk about on this show a lot, because it's about psychoanalysis and also like literally just about, a part of our tagline is like the ways we suffer now. We are like deep into thinking about various forms of human suffering. And we're coming off of doing a bunch of mailbag episodes from listeners. And I feel like so many of the questions have just been about like hope in the face of despair. And I loved stumbling onto that quotation that you used to open the final chapter, the Grace Lee Boggs quote, and just like the part about becoming more human humans. It just hit in this way that, and the way that you develop it. Because, not you, what we are up against and the way that like, your book like outlines it in this way that is, so overwhelming. I was just, moved certainly, but also just helped. Let's say helped by the way in which the sort of like inexorable march of both qualitative and quantitative analysis paints a really dire picture. Like it's met equally, but in this way that is not at all cloying with just like resources, not in the way that you're often talking about resources, but like psychic resources. Like I'm grateful for that. I thought it's a spectacular book.
Thank you.
I oftentimes have encounters with people where they always want to end the conversation with hope. They're like, please, can you give us some hope? Or like, we want to feel hope. And I've never really...
Make us feel it.
Yeah, I've never really understood what that means, because it's never like an action plan, or it's never like I'm like, or do they want me to hand them like a proposition? Do they want to have a feeling? How does this relate to either undoing or kind of ameliorating what came immediately before? And I at times I feel like people want hope the way they want like a pizza delivered, like, or they want like, and then the same gesture too, like you want the cops to show up, like make me feel quote unquote safe. And, that's just not security isn't safety, but also just, that's not how relationships work. But again, to have these texts by you where you're in ongoing and really just astute conversation with people who've come before and are capable of writing about and describing these systems that are so disempowering and overwhelming, but then also repeatedly talk about and meet people. But you talk about meeting people and meeting people where they actually are, and you kind of diffuse that impulse of like, well, everything has to be fixed in my lifetime, or I have to have a grand plan, or where's the grand plan from you that I can call my congressman about? It actually, again, now that I've evacuated the term of meaning, I don't want to use it again, but it actually does give me a kind of hope, or I feel like a type of relational hope that is, at least I can keep going.
Yeah, that's the thing I hope. There's that word again. But I think the idea that people want hope like they want a pizza delivered is a really spot on way of putting it. People aren't willing or I don't know. It's easy not to see what the scale of your ambitions demands of you as a recipient of those ambitions, or as a accomplisher of those goals. And you see it with everything, 5-minute abs, right? Like it's just so much easier to want something than to become the kind of person who could actually get it.
Yeah.
And it's hard enough on the individual level, but once you start thinking on a generational level what it would be like to become the generation of people that could achieve something, it becomes even more difficult. And I tried to strike the balance of not shying away from the scale of that, but also not shying away from the fact that generations have in fact done this, and that could be us.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to introduce our guest, Olúfẹ Táíwò. Olúfẹ is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University and the author of Elite Capture. His public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, has been featured in The New Yorker, Hammer and Hope, The Nation, Boston Review, Dissent, The Appeal, Slate, Al Jazeera, The New Republic, Aeon, and Foreign Policy. And today we are talking about his book, Reconsidering Reparations, Why Climate Justice and Constructive Politics Are Needed in the Wake of Slavery and Colonialism. There is a recent paperback edition of it, which you can all get your hands on, which has occasioned our conversation today. Olúfẹ, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to start with an unbelievably long question, but I swear that it is mostly ground clearing, and there's actually a straightforward question here. Because it's a show about psychoanalysis, I really want to set up a few of the concerns of the book and kind of map them a little bit onto what we do. And I want to also pull out a couple of quotations, both from your previous work and from the most recent book, in order to situate our listeners. So we often, start this show asking folks how they came to psychoanalysis. And certainly there are interlocutors across your work that are more or less explicit in working in some sort of dialogue with psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic themes. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Frantz Fanon, who comes up in your book, Elite Capture, specifically in the context of how in the second half of the 20th century, the hopes and expectations of many for newly independent nations were disabused by the realities of neocolonial exploitation. And you regularly take on topics that psychoanalysts wrestle with too, as when in that book, Elite Capture, you write about trauma and the discourse of deference to trauma discourse. So here's a line that I want, or a couple of lines that I want our listeners to hear. Quote, "Contra the old expression, pain, whether born of oppression or not, is a poor teacher. Suffering is partial, short-sighted, and self-absorbed. We shouldn't have a politics that expects different. Oppression is not a prep school. When it comes down to it, the thing I believe most deeply about deference politics is that it asks something of trauma that it cannot give. It asks the traumatized to shoulder burdens alone that we ought to share collectively, lifting them up onto a pedestal in order to hide below them." Close quote. But by the same token, as you observe in the book we're talking about today, Reconsidering Reparations, quote, "An entire industry of racial commentary, from think pieces to blogs to academic studies and whole fields of researchers, centers upon convincing imagined skeptical whites or global northerners that the social sky is in fact blue. We aim to disrupt, contextualize, or falsify stereotypes and correct how we are perceived. And we try to manipulate how attention to different social problems or populations is parceled out. Most worrying, we spend so much time and energy responding to others' mistakes that we lose the ability to distinguish their questions from ours." Close quote. So rather than trying to, kind of like fit your work into the psychoanalytic paradigm in some sort of like shoehorny kind of way. That's not a word. I'm making it a word today. We mostly wanted to register something that both Patrick and I really admire about your work. Your willingness to interrogate some of the most load-bearing terms, concepts, and narratives that structure contemporary ideology, and to cut to the heart of their actual function and basic moral stakes while making your own claims. And to me, this seems to be a theme throughout your work, whether it's writing about the law, about the appropriation of the language of identity politics, about the material inheritances of history, about the connotations of justice, and so much more. And so that was like the longest setup for me to ask, how did you come to do the work that you do?
So I actually, first of all, thank you for the question. Thanks for the attention to the work, and thanks for having me. I actually want to start off my answer to this by pointing at Fanon. It's not every day. It's not every day that I get to talk to people that understand psychoanalysis. And so I do like to take the opportunity. And I won't butcher Freud or anything, but I will just remind you and the listeners of some stuff about Fanon that we don't always talk about that I think is useful for keeping in mind what his insights were about. And Fanon, of course, is a guy who has deep theoretical insights about the structure of society and the structure of our kind of affective relationship to that society and what these things have to do with each other. But those deep political and theoretical insights are ones that he developed not as a commentator or a detached scholar or, a sociologist or anthropologist with binoculars, watching from afar, right? The thing about Fanon that many of us know and respect is that Fanon was an active participant in these struggles, right? Fanon was a combat veteran himself. He fought in the Free French forces. He, earned a medal in the offensives, the Allied offensives to remove the Nazis from Provence during the Second World War. His more well-known time as a doctor during the Algerian Revolution is also one that was active and practical. He was treating French soldiers, including those who had committed torture. He was treating Algerian fighters who had been tortured. And so, Fanon was under no illusions about what trauma does to people. He had thoughts that were not especially reducible to the pithy quotes that are often picked out of his work, out of context. But more to the point that I'm making now, the positions Fanon's taking about psychoanalysis and trauma and pain and violence and decolonizing are happening during active national independence struggles that he is a participant in. And so his positions on these questions are not detachable from his positions as a participant in a particular era of politics with a particular era of commitments and struggles and problems. And so, my answer is the same. Obviously, I don't have nearly the resume Fanon does. I'm not a combat veteran, right? I have no medals, any kind. But I was doing organizing. I was organizing in LA as part of my union, as someone fighting for racial justice, as someone in a coalition of people fighting ICE, and doing so in an era where the planet is heating up. And so the commitments that I've taken, hopefully explicitly in this book, both of the books that I've written, are just, my theoretical reflections on a set of actual practical hurdles that were in front of me and that were in front of my comrades in LA, that are in front of all of us, right? We're all living on this planet that's heating up. Those of us who were involved in the particular worker struggles at the UC campuses would have had to think about what the UC Board of Regents were up to. Those of us who were fighting ICE and the cops would have been and were very interested in what the LA Sheriff's Department was doing and the particular rationales that they had for what they were up to. And we would have had to take on the practical obstacles that were in front of us and success. Some of those were just external practical obstacles, like the LA sheriffs having guns and weird gangs and a commitment from the political power structure in California to protect them. But some of them were the kinds of theoretical ones that I'm dealing with in the book. Even amongst the people who agree we should fight ICE, agree we should fight for racial justice, we don't all necessarily agree on what that means. We don't all have the same viewpoint on how injustices of today relate to injustices of yesterday. And the people in the middle, who are neither ICE officers, nor sheriffs, nor active members of our group, who we might try to win to our side or win to neutrality also have different perspectives on those things. And there is the direct scholarly question of what the answer is, what today's injustice, in fact, has to do with yesterday's injustice. But there's also the practical matter of trying to deal with a political environment, a media environment where people are not of one mind on those questions, and trying to figure out how to have productive conversations across disagreement, and try to get people to see points of view that maybe they don't start out their lives or start out their adult lives in any case already seeing. So yeah, I had, on the one hand, this graduate school training in philosophy and thinking about politics, and I had just the political stuff that comes up because I was living where I was in the era of world history that I lived.
That's super clarifying and really helpful. And as I hear you say all that, I think about both your work in its own terms and also ways in which I think our audience will be able both to get an initial handle on it, but then I think really sort of sit with it and process it. And what I'm thinking about specifically is how instead of kind of accepting the terms of this perennial kind of flat debate of like, this is what theory is and this is what practice is, right? And these are constantly sort of moving targets, but also remain weirdly abstract. I feel like what's at stake in a lot of what you're doing is this kind of awareness of and an active engagement with, let's just call it broadly speaking, like this idea of like identification, or rather identification as a problem, not just abstractly, but in terms of identifying where you or anyone like finds themselves in a given moment. What are the problems that they're facing abstractly? Who are the other participants in creating those problems, your allies in seeking to transform those problems, or your opponents at different levels? But understanding that active identification isn't just sort of saturated with affect and has to respond to kind of calls for diagnostic clarity, but that it also has to have some sort of relationship with questions of agency, and that like arbitrating abstract like overdetermination in terms of meaning is also necessarily a process of thinking about overdetermination in like the causal sense of like multiple forces coming together to produce complex emergent systems, and all in a way that is, well, I guess dynamic. It involves this give and take, this possibility of movement. And in that sense, the term that I find myself also thinking about is just not just like overdetermination and all these different registers, but just like personal determination. And a kind of like, how do I determine myself in relation to this? Or what am I determined to do? And how am I capable of detecting or making possible movement through all these different things?
Yeah, which also bleeds into like a term that I think is really important in reconsidering reparations, which is self-determination, right? Like in a variety of registers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the things I try to really rein in, because, whenever you're talking about something across very different contexts, times of history or parts of the world, there is a level of abstraction that is useful and productive for making those kinds of comparisons or points work. But it's very easy to get lost in the sauce, right? We have all these debates about, even terms like self-determination. What does that mean, right? I like that particular word, but there's a interminable set of debates to have there. And as the particular kind of weird nerd I am, I will enjoy having them, but it's not everyone's bag, right? Not all 8 billion of us necessarily need to run those conversations top to bottom. So I try to rein that in. I try to say as concretely as I can, what we're talking about is changing the world, not changing the world in the way that, like, I don't know, the voiceover of a Coca-Cola commercial changes the world, right? Or discusses changing the world, but changing the world in the way that, a city planner changes the world, or changing the world in the way a construction worker changes the world, right? actually literally making changes to the way that our systems operate in tangible ways. That is the thing we are talking about, from my point of view, when we're talking about social change. And we get so caught up in the particular symbols that dominate, especially the culture war, that we often forget that the thing we're talking about is as literal and concrete and identifiable as it in fact is. And this is one of the things that I find fascinating about, again, bringing it back to Fanon, right? What are the bits of Fanon that people remember that circulate in the academy? You know, these ethereal claims he makes about libido and shit. I mean, stuff y'all would understand better than me, right? And Fanon took that stuff seriously. I'm not meaning to belittle it, but you know, Fanon also was writing about like how to maintain military supply lines across the African continent, right? Fanon, whether he was talking about the psyche or whether he was talking about trucks shipping ammunition, again, he understood himself as being involved in a very concrete political struggle. And whether he was talking abstractly or in the concrete, he understood the relationship of what he was saying to that concrete political struggle. And I think regardless of what register we're interested in, regardless of what symbolic or ethereal stuff we might find fascinating about a political word here or a symbolic political struggle there, we need to be able to work our way from that to concrete political reality, actually existing political systems in reality. And so long as we can do that, you know, we can go wild with the abstraction. I'm very happy to be on the team of people doing that. But
Team abstraction.
We need to be able to do both. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask you a little bit about the origins of the most recent book? I mean, it is this really, you know, it's a tour de force. It's this really magisterial work that you're tying together global history, data from contemporary economics and public health, of course, philosophy, and so much more. Can we ask what led you to write this book in the first place, and also about the impetus behind the most recent edition, which has an additional new foreword?
So I was seeing two kinds of disconnects in stuff that I was doing around racial justice organizing wise. One of the disconnects was amongst the people doing racial justice stuff or doing kind of, let's say, related political organizing, which is just a disconnect I alluded to earlier, right? There was a group of people that thought that racial justice was like a variety of unfair treatment, like present day unfair treatment. So more or less the kind of implicit definition of racism as racial discrimination or the application of racist ideology, and didn't, you know, we're aware, of course, that there is a historical reason that people acted this way, but didn't see the history itself as being the thing to work back against. And there was another group of people that I think more powerfully understood that there was something essentially historical about what racism is, what racist social structures, structural racism, whatever you want to call it, is, but were thinking of that in a primarily backward-looking way. So chronicling the racial disparities that result from that history and keeping track of the way people and institutions today continue on the injustices of yesterday. And, you know, neither of those are things that I think are entirely off base. There's reason to focus on present day discrimination. There's reason to focus on the legacy of racism, but I didn't feel like either of them, from my point of view, were anticipating tomorrow's version of this problem in the way that I thought was necessary, right? You know, if you think racism is bad now, if you thought Hurricane Katrina was bad, what happens when Hurricane Katrina is every year, right? And so I was seeing a lot of stuff on the climate change side of things that wasn't getting uptake from my point of view on the racial justice side of things. And so I just wanted to tell a story of how those things related in a way that made the point most powerfully. And I couldn't really think of an issue that better showed the entanglements between past, present, and future on the racial justice side of things than reparations. It's something people have, rightly been pushing for generations. And so, I thought maybe this is a place to add something to the discussion. Maybe we can show or talk about how, the things people have said, the way they've responded to past changes in the structure of racism and racial injustice is something we should be learning from now, today, and applying to our new, different political, ecological situation.
Absolutely. I want to ask you a question because we like to do a lot of ground clearing, a lot of like getting terms out, and I think it is important. I've been saying just the title, Reconsidering Reparations, but the subtitle is really important, right? Which is why climate justice and constructive politics are needed in the wake of slavery and colonialism. And we're going to get more explicitly into the argument about reparations and climate justice and the particular view of reparations. But one thing I really want to make sure our listeners have like at their fingertips in order to appreciate the full scope and the full force of the argument is to ask you to talk a little bit about one of the key terms in your account, which is the idea of global racial empire. Can you tell us a little bit about what this term means and how it helps you clarify the landscape of contemporary distributions of power, opportunity, risk, and suffering?
So by global racial empire, I'm essentially just trying to invite the reader to connect three things: racism and racial injustice, colonialism and imperialism as political processes, and the planetary scale. And I just came up with a term just for ease of reference. If people call it global racial empire or they call it, racial capitalism, that's a term that's been in circulation longer. Or if they just call it capitalism, or if they just call it racism, that's all fine by me. So long as these three things are connected for people, but they often aren't. And I think partially in part because the conversations about those three topic areas are largely independent of each other. The academic literature on planetary economic integration, of course, acknowledges, the scholars are aware, that it was colonial ventures that linked the world into one large planetary system of trade and economics, but it's not necessarily the central theme of economic history. Scholars have long made the connection, maybe most notably Eric Williams, between the racial system of slavery that developed in the Atlantic system and the urge and impetus to colonize the land masses on the other side of the Atlantic from European colonists, but it's not something that is always emphasized by scholars who are working on that set of issues and set of places. And I think the thing that emerges when you link all of these things together is that the process of developing a global system that was economically integrated on a planetary scale, and the process of developing a global system where African descended peoples are at the bottom of an emergent kind of racial hierarchy, and the process of developing a global system that was dominated by these particular institutions that we call states, and that relate in the what has now become the state system all were the same process. It was the same events, it was the same groups of people, it was the same institutions, it was the same trade links. And when we see them that way, it helps explain why those very same processes led to power accumulating over here and poverty accumulating over there.
I love those chapters a great deal, both because there's so much in there that sort of granularly speaks to my interest, these data points about just, let's talk about the gold and silver trade and just like what these numbers actually translate into the present. It's just boggling. But on another level, and again, I'm just speaking in sort of abstract philosophical / psychoanalytic terms, what strikes me about the work it does as an analytic, the idea of sort of a global racial empire, is that it kind of makes uncanny our relationship to the ways we understand history to be periodized, right? Or the eternality of things like the nation state and how that's ramifies in everything from our education system to the narratives we tell ourselves, but also that it subverts, and a lot of what happens when we just think about the present in relation to questions of social justice or any other type of political sort of organization, qua impacting our sense of ourselves as subjects, right? And I think this idea of the subject, if I just could toy with it for a second, is like you're the subject of your phenomenological perception, but you're like the subject of a political order, though I guess we don't like to talk about that in the U.S., where, we don't have a sovereign, and even though I guess we kind of do, but whatever. Like we're not subjects of the king, but whatever. But like there's an entire implicit series, again, of like identifications, disidentifications, but also like selective connections and disconnections that are operative in terms of how we parse issues and understand ourselves. And I think that ramifies too on the level of how like disciplines shape this stuff up and chop these things up, and how we, above all though, how we kind of, and I'm using we very broadly, but just I think people have limited access, or like rather maybe there's a bandwidth limitation to how many different types of identification we keep in our heads at a given time. Who knows, right? And I think sure some people are more cynical and opportunistic about this than others, and sometimes these disavowals feel like almost like psychotic in their character. But what the idea of global racial empire does for me, and I think just does in the book, is it forces the reader to confront how their sort of like subjectivity, but also their like sense of who and where they are is downstream. And you have these wonderful metaphors involving of water and how it cuts channels but that like you are actually the output, in some ways like the object of a process that has kind of extruded you or from which you've emerged, and that also historically has markedly differential ways of literally naming people or treating them as objects, and producing and killing and empowering people variously in different points at different times through these broader processes of fairly impersonal extraction and fungibility and exchange and all these things, but that somehow our sense of ourselves in the present has to be opened up, or at least made aware of how we are actually downstream of that, but also standing in the middle of this course. And if we're going to do world making projects, then we should be attuned to how the world has been made, but also how it's continually being made and unmade, or what's being foreclosed through these sort of processes of identification or disidentification or not making connections.
Yeah, I'm sort of endlessly fascinated by, growing up when I did, particularly in the 90s and aughts, there was a really robust conversation around meritocracy. The bell curve had come out.
Oh yeah.
There were all the debates around affirmative action. So, a time, irretrievably different from this one where everyone's cool. In any case, people have this idea that I don't know to what extent people genuinely believe it versus to what extent people just kind of use it as a sort of device. But there's this idea floating around that what we have in America, or at least what we ought to have, is a meritocracy. And what that means is being rewarded for your skills and work ethic and accomplishments, irrespective of particular things about you. And, that's fine as far as it goes. But, if you're the kind of person that might become an academic philosopher, you might start asking some annoying questions, right? As 9-year-old me was want to do. I would just have these conversations with people and like, well, what exactly do you mean by merit? And they're like, oh, well, we took the test and the test said that my soul has this many magic intelligence points, and that's why I should be the manager of Denny's and you should work the fries or whatever. I don't know, some kind of story of that kind. And I think the thing that you have to hold fixed to make sense of the hiring and higher ed admissions and various kind of distributive aspects of our system and interpret those as doing the work of sorting the meritorious from the less meritorious is you have to hold fixed things like, what was your first language? Maybe most directly, what country were you born in? Because they're not giving these, they're not giving the PSAT to kids in Namibia, as far as I know. And I would just get a kind of silence in response to these annoying kinds of questions. Occasionally, people would defend, why the US is great or why it's justified for the US or any other similarly rich country to just be concerned about its own citizens. But then you could just repeat that process there. Well, how did it come to be that the US had the money to have this higher ed system? What explains the fact that the standardized tests in Botswana or in Albania don't have the stakes of whether or not you go to Harvard versus state school, because the schools there have a lower endowment or whatever, right? You're just pushing the historical can down one level or whatever. But all these things came to be for some reason or other, historically speaking. And the effect of them, we all know on some level, is that people who were born in the right place to the right kind of parents with the right kind of money have orders of magnitude more life chances than people born in the wrong place to the wrong parents with the wrong amount of money. And, we might quibble about whether we should understand those differences as being, truly down to race or more directly to parents' income or parents' wealth. But no one is in fact of the opinion that those distinctions aren't there, right? It is not a toss-up, whether or not the Trump kids are going to go to school in New England or Burundi. So I don't know what the fuck we're talking about when we talk about meritocracy. And for the 35 years of my life, I've never known. And I found this infinitely interesting and ended up, writing at least one, maybe 1.5 books about my various hangups around this conversation. But I think one of the things at the bottom of this discrepancy is just this historical question that you're talking about. What do you think you are? Are you at the bottom an American whose lot is only fairly compared with other Americans? And then what does it mean that you came to be American? And what does the explanation of what America is have to do with the desert claim that you have to be compared to other Americans rather than to Cambodians or something? And, I don't know. Well-adjusted people can apparently live their lives without sorting out their answers to these questions, but I'm not one of those. So I racked my brain around it for a decade or so.
observe in the book, this whole way of thinking really goes against the grain of some of these foundational narratives, which are, cherished, I think is not too strong a word, which are cherished by so many citizens in the global north. They're taught in schools. They're celebrated in national holidays. And at the risk of torturing a metaphor, for myself as somebody who's a teacher, I find that I'm like swimming upstream in order to try to convince students that they are in fact downstream, right, of all of the factors that you're talking about here, and that those factors are connected, right? Like it's incredibly hard. And I don't think you even have to have profound psychoanalytic commitments to talk about like the repression of the idea that the individual is, emerges and is the output of, vast historical and structural forces that are beyond their control. And yet, like, we find it so difficult to reckon with this. And this way of thinking in terms of whether you want to call it racial capitalism or global racial empire, it also, and I'll tip my hand as a fellow philosopher. This is the part where I'm like really want to get into some of this because, like, man, I love the way that you're using Rawls while also like demolishing Rawls in like 2 beautiful paragraphs. Like my soul just sang. Well, anyway. I'm going to finish my question, but I had to get that. I had to get that in there. I mean, the way of thinking that the book's way of thinking, implicates, I think profoundly implicates some of the most influential philosophical legitimations of the state and the global order. So I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about these. Of course, I do have Rawls in mind, although, I did kind of wake up thinking about, Patrick walked in this morning and was like, I had a weird look on my face and I was like, get out of here. I'm thinking about John Locke. I'm thinking about John Locke. But like, I wonder if we can talk about some of these philosophical legitimations of the state, and particularly about, the rhetoric of equality and fairness, right? Fairness being a very important term for a figure like Rawls, and the ways in which thinking about the present in continuity with the past, which is so important to your book, the ways in which that reveals what so many accounts of the liberal order and the state form just fundamentally disavow.
Yeah, I did my best to be fair to Rawls.
You did a beautiful job, but I will say Rawls is the only person that I've ever just like straight up taken it off of a syllabus because I was like, I'm so bored by teaching this. I don't want to do it anymore. I don't care. And then I added a lot of this was like in an intro to ethics class, and I just was like, screw it. We're doing 2 weeks of Hume instead.
Nice.
Nice. Moral sentiments.
Like, I say all this with all the love and respect in the world. Some of my best friends are Rawlsians, right? So, all that said, I'll just say what it was like for me reading Rawls for the first time, just to give a sense of why it is that I ended up saying what I had to say about Rawls. Keep in mind, as we've just been talking about, right? One of the animating questions I had since I was a kid is, how does who I am relate to this whole history that very radically differentiates all of my cousins from me and all of the aforementioned from everyone that I live around here in the US, right? All of my cousins being in Nigeria and all the people I live around being in the US, right? Like, that was a fundamental political question. That was the philosophical political question, or at least one of the core ones that I had, coming into the study of political philosophy. And I just sort of took it for granted that political philosophy would be something about that. Come to find out, not so much. So, for those that aren't familiar with John Rawls is a very, very, very influential political philosopher. He has this theory of philosophy, this theory of political philosophy that was most prominently developed in the book A Theory of Justice, which is a classic work of political philosophy. And one of the devices used in this book to get things going is to start off with this hypothetical position where members of society who are theorized, at least in the first edition, as heads of households, think about the rules for setting up society from behind a veil of ignorance, as Rawls puts it. So not knowing where they will end up in society. And I think maybe just as importantly, not knowing, I think, how society has ended up in the position where they are behind a veil of ignorance, right? So the thing Rawls emphasizes is the kind of forward-looking veil of ignorance, where you don't know where you're going to end up under the rules. But as I'm emphasizing in the reparations book, you might think also about the backward-looking ignorance about how your current position in life, say as head of household, relates to the history that produced the society that has whatever options, whatever natural resources, whatever potential institutions that it has now. But all those questions, looking forward or backward, are deeply historical questions. And Rawls finds a way to start, and if you ask some people, complete political philosophy without answering any of them. So, you know, from my point of view, it's like, what if we didn't have any of the problems of political philosophy? I suppose, except for the one that remains, which is, what is the definition of justice in institutional terms? And in fairness, if you thought that was the question to answer for a political philosopher, this is actually a very sensible way of answering that question. And I do think it is a question political philosophy should answer. So, you know, point Rawls for that. But I nevertheless have my deep historical worries about how our justifications and our institutions ought to respond, not to the history-free question of what possible fair institutions are, but to the extremely historically laden question of how we build fair institutions in the context of a deeply unfair, accumulated historical legacy of violence and dispossession and debt and institutional formation. And I think that question is also worth asking and trying to answer from the perspective of political philosophy.
So I have a confession, and this is going to make, I realize listeners can't see this, but I'm turning even pinker than usual as I reveal this to Abby also, which is that A Theory of Justice was the first philosophy book I ever read.
What?
And I read it all the way through.
Oh, well.
Yeah, well, because I did high school debate, and when I was getting on the high school debate team, was specifically Lincoln Douglas debate, right? So it was divorced from a lot of the policy stuff. It was like, we're going to talk about values and value premises. This is the text that is like a Bible style text. And I use that actually with leading into that overdetermination for a second, because so I read it. And I found Abby's copy of it, but I think my copy.
That is actually your copy.
Really? That I have multiple copies.
I think I took it to my office because you were like, I never need to read this again. And I was like, maybe I'll need to pull it out.
I think the copy I read is also though in your office, which is like the cerulean kind of blue one, like that original like era reprint. The point is I was spared having to see my own notes from when I was 14.
Oh, maybe that
when I looked this over.
Okay, that's not important.
I did have to reconfront the fact that I remember when I was first reading it being like, this seems pretty clear, just like straightforwardly clear. Like at least it wasn't as complicated as what I then, we tried to read like a second treatise on government or whatever in some of these social contract texts. But I remember being very taken by the fact that I was like, wow, motherfucker has graphs. And now I look at the graphs about like the distribution of like fairness or these things he calls primary goods. And I'm like, this is madness, or at least this is just completely, I don't know what's going on here. But more to the point, I think I then also tried to read the book where he kind of like the laws of nations or peoples and the political liberalism or whatever. And I very quickly was like, oh, he's just scaling this up to the international order. And I don't need to read this. But what I don't think I had fully interrogated, and Actually, before I say that, I should say I'm not a Rawlsian. I very rapidly like turned away from Rawls, and the only thing I really took from it was just maybe this idea of the original position has some value as like a heuristic regulative thought exercise that we can then be like, well, let's invoke this to account for how we feel about the current state of affairs in relation to some sort of abstract kind of, I don't know, to deal with to disidentify from the present moment, right? But even then, I just, again, further disclosures, embarrassing stuff here. I'll say this is probably also because there is, I think, a kind of like a crypto-Christianity to the like, well, look to those who are the least off in society. And also just, my mother was, I'm an immigrant, right? And I was very much invested in this kind of meritocratic leveling up through institutions in a way that I don't even think I understood to be ideological. It's like, this is how I'm going to move through this stuff. And I think here, some of what you said about like intellect points or like what your RPG loadout is by the roll of the dice before you get a job like that. I think there's a whole thing we could say about like what a gifted program makes you think is like yours versus what you owe or don't owe that we could get into. But I subsequently, I think, came really to understand like these bodies don't have race, there's no sexual difference, and there's also no history in this, right? So turning to Marx and among other things and abandoning Christianity were kind of helpful for me in abandoning Rawls. But what I think is what your work shook loose for me was, one, I think the fact that I hadn't considered this, I already alluded to this, the thing that goes untested in all of this, which is namely the existence of the nation-state form.
Yeah.
Right? That this is a given.
Do you want to, Patrick, just do the like real quick 1-2 punch of the critique here?
I just got this just
because like we're like nerding out over it, and I feel like we're not giving our listeners the like, because I think for a lot of people, not just, baby Patrick or high school Patrick or whatever, like this is a very plausible, like when you present it to undergraduates, they're often like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. Veil of ignorance, the original position. Like let's go. We're gonna solve all these problems.
Yeah, I'll just give it real quick. I'm just gonna read 2 sentences from your work, and then I want to just say something that's just been bothering me that I've wanted to scream in light of thinking about all this too. So yeah, as you say, to apply these assumptions or the insight derived from them about hypothetical states to the actual ones we find in the real world would go beyond oversimplification. A colonized nation is literally regulated by an external entity, not its internal polity, while what a colonizing nation affords its citizens depends directly on what they extract from the colonies. Nation-states didn't come into existence as closed systems, and in fact, their relations to each other have been constitutive the whole time. And that's just, again, that's like a scalpel and a buzzsaw and a bomb all at once. It just cuts through so much bullshit. But also what I think it laid bare for me, and here I will thank some psychoanalytic thinking about this, was how, on the one hand, what the Rawlsian exercise of the veil of ignorance seems to do, just functionally, it's like, here's a thought, here's some thinking, let's get abstract, let's pull away from the particular, even as it smuggles in the particular. It asks you to offer some sort of account for contingency, qua like the accident of birth, I guess you could call it, while simultaneously not interrogating and taking as given one of the primary sorting mechanisms for human beings on this planet, namely where they're born. Like, so it's accidental in this abstract sense, but it's like you have citizenship papers that's not an accident somehow. So you get to have it both ways there. But also, like, I found myself on the one hand thinking about this as like a reprise of other scenes in philosophical history. I'm thinking like there's this Platonic sort of thing, like we're all this reservoir of souls and like we're going to get born into these bodies in some way, or like that this is the scene of the originary social contract. But more specifically in just psychoanalytic terms, I was thinking about how this is like a screen memory, or it's like a fantasy. It's almost like a family romance of where you came from, what your destiny is. It's okay. You're just reflective enough to have earned what you have. And also, I mean, I don't even want to be like, this is going back to the womb or some other bullshit, but it literally does seem to be about dignifying, palliating, and reasserting a kind of narcissism or like a self-focus on your own position in all the most sort of insidious ways.
And while we're kind of taking a hatchet to Rawls through psychoanalysis. And I, like, again, I don't want to like, this is an important theory. And I think it's really crucial for listeners to also understand that, you know, Rawls is working with the distributive theory of justice, and that is important for your argument. Like distribution and redistribution, not just of resources, is crucial for the entire book. But I think, Patrick, to take the argument that you're making even a little bit further, and at the risk of reaching a little, and I will take that risk, is that there's something about the fantasy of the original position that is actually like an Oedipal victory, in the sense that you literally don't have parents. Like, not only do you not have history, like you are so fully evacuated of history that you're even evacuated of personal history of the family, right? I mean, it's kind of remarkable. It's kind of remarkable. But again, that element of justice as having something to do with distribution and redistribution, right? That's good stuff. Like we don't want to, you know, we can beat up on Rawls, and we can beat up on all sorts of political philosophers, but I think I don't want to lose that element in the ways in which this is, you know, this is very much as an argument relies on that concept, while, you know, really puncturing some of the fundamental fantasies that structure it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess one thing I would add is that there's actually a very deep and fascinating historical interpretive question to ask, I think, both squarely about Rawls and the Rawlsian project as an expression of Rawls's thought, and the field of philosophy's response to Rawls as an expression of a generation's anxieties, perhaps, particularly in the US. Because the conclusions Rawls comes to, the scale of redistribution that I think would be required to accomplish the Rawlsian project as he lays it out, is suspiciously like the kind of shit I would say, right? Yeah. It's suspiciously leftist. And the context for Rawls actually just is the same, historically speaking, the same political context as the people I'm drawing on as exemplars of the kind of national independence, world-making viewpoint, right? The thing people kind of have this tendency to write history on parallel tracks unless, you know, explicit connections are made. But, you know, keep in mind, A Theory of Justice comes out in 1971. Some of the building block essays are the late 50s and throughout the 60s, right? And the people I'm quoting, you know, fighting for national independence against their historical racist colonizer empires, I usually give the example of Amilcar Cabral, are writing at the exact same time, right? They are contemporaries, you know. Amilcar Cabral is connecting the entire racial edifice of the history of colonialism to colonial domination at the same time as Rawls is having, you know, these fucking thought experiments about the veil of ignorance in the original position, right? And so, you know, a read that is out there of this, that I think is a legitimate kind of interpretive stance, is, you know, John Rawls, combat veteran, very learned professor, very morally convicted guy, is trying to say something in the context of the Cold War that he doesn't feel he can say unless he avails himself of the tools of analytic philosophy in a particular way that confers legitimacy on the project. And post-Cold War, people have remembered the principles of distributive justice he advanced and this peculiar meta-philosophy of how he arrives at them, but have forgotten the relationship between the very particular historical context in which he went for them that way and like tried to make something of them in the 21st century, or even I guess later in the 20th century, that maybe they didn't need to. The complicating thing is that, Rawls, unlike Amilcar Cabral, actually lives to the end of the century and just keeps doing the thing he was doing before. So, it complicates tying the metaphilosophical choices to the Cold War, the methodological choices to the Cold War, but it doesn't, I think, totally take off the table that reading of Rawls and Rawlsians.
I wonder, the question of like anxieties and what can or can't be said, both in his moment, but then later, what is like implied, or what this sort of like perlocutionary, I guess, or like function of making this argument does in any subsequent moment, feels really suggestive to me as I think about, and I'm trying to translate certain theoretical vocabularies live, so forgive me if this is too abstract, about like how sometimes I feel like exercises like Rawls, and I probably say this too about like certain types of Kantian formalism also, right, seem to be about not so much asking people who engage in them to rethink the fundaments of everything they think, but rather to kind of like enter again like this abstract mode of deliberation, but that it has implicit guardrails that effectively the point is to imply consent for actually existing circumstances in some way. And I don't want to say that it's necessarily like a kind of pact, or it has that kind of ugliness of a gesture that I hear on the internet all the time, and I really despise when someone's like, well, I'm sure we can all agree that. I'm like, oftentimes the worst shit is getting snuck in there, right? Like, no. Who's we? No. But beyond that, like, it seems to activate an implicit anxiety in some way, in the sense that sort of other types of, again, invocations of like the level playing field, or the individual is the ultimate point of responsibility for all their choices, with this kind of like, therefore the grace of God go you kind of logic, whereby it's like, let's do this type of cogitation and talk about the accident of birth with the excluded. What this fantasy does is it sort of excludes the anxiety of how you could have been born somewhere else entirely. Right. And in that way, like it has this kind of.
That's interesting, because it kind of smuggles in the idea that you have to think about it, while also like actually foreclosing it at the same moment. I had not thought about that.
Yeah. And at that level, it's sort of, I'm not saying that this necessarily was the case in Rawls's time, right? But as, well, in our contemporary moment, particularly as like the gap between what even Rawls was suggesting and what we actually have gets even like what's left of like the tensile strength of the social safety net or the social fabric. It's in tatters, right? But there is this, it has a character almost of an implicit threat, right? Where it's like, you're lucky to even have what you do. It's not like it's a best of all possible worlds kind of argument. It's like, this is the best you could hope for, and be lucky that you have it. And that is, again, I think your work is making me think just that there's this kind of, what is the function of this as a fantasy of this type of discourse? Like, how does it smuggle in this entire networks of identifications, disidentifications, narrative entanglements, expectations, but also like what horizons does it entirely foreclose, while also conjuring actual real world landscapes, present and near future, that are terrifying to you, and then maybe even set in motion the entire discussion?
Yeah, and maybe another way to frame that same thought is like, how does starting political philosophy here distribute attention?
Yes.
Across the landscape of possible political questions we could ask. And I think definitely anxieties are playing a role in it. I think aspirations are also playing a role in that, people sense on some level that it is better for the conversation to stay in this ahistorical mode than, in whatever version of history these pesky divestment movements are trying to direct us to, right? And that level isn't even that subconscious, right? I think, you corner people in a conversation the right way, though they will outright say this. But in general, there's some work being done by the suggestion made by the framework itself that what we ought to attend to is this very circumscribed set of questions around how the resources, however they came to become resources, ought to be distributed amongst whoever happens to have made it here, right? And we have no questions about how those resources came to be, where here is, and who stands armed at the border between here and there. Because those questions take us to a place that we don't want to go. And these questions keep us somewhere nice and safe.
You're queuing me up beautifully to ask you about the concept that is the centerpiece of the book, which is the idea of reparations itself. And I want to say also, Patrick told me that not everybody is as interested as I am in like, here are like a number of different views and here are the so that I
am interested, for the record. I'm personally very interested. This was not me negging anybody.
I know. I'm just saying. So I'm merely going to say, as I queue up this question, that like one of the things that I also really loved about this book is the way that it walks through all of these. I don't quite want to say like competing, because that's not really the right word, but distinctive views of reparations, like with the harm repair view, the relationship repair view, and you use these all. But I want to recommend it as like for people who also like want to think about like, how are the different ways that this idea of reparations, which for so many people is just like intuitive good sense, and for so many other people is just like fucking radioactive, like it walks you in a beautiful and really lucid way through those views. Okay, I just wanted to say that. Now I'll actually ask you my question. But so your view, the view that's distinctive here that you're advancing, which you call the constructive view, it's distinct from some of these other accounts. And, in part because, it's really thinking about reconfiguring our built environments, but it's also thinking about like our quote unquote social grammars. But it also thinks comparatively across time and space, and it draws connections to the here and now without, reductively flattering terms and identities into one another, especially with regards to race and racialization. And I think this is particularly evocative for us as people who are in the business of talking a lot about identity and identification and disidentification. You warn against these sort of simplistic binary logics of victim and victimizer, while disambiguating between ideas of complicity, responsibility, and liability. I loved also the responsibility liability distinction. It does so much work. In other words, and perhaps this is in more psychoanalytic language, you suggest that reparations is both a material project, but also an enterprise in what we might call recognition, identification, and or disidentification, which is, again, a long way of leading up to the question, which is to ask if you can tell our listeners about the distinctive view, what you call the constructive view of reparations that is at the heart of the book.
So in general, I identify three kind of families of ways of thinking about reparations or arguing for reparations or framing what reparations could accomplish as a project. And I appreciate that you declined to pose them as adversaries, because I don't think of them as adversaries either.
No.
And I think, the constructive view is something that I think tries to get at what the other views show us is worthwhile.
Yeah, so, absolutely. That comes through so clearly.
Yeah. So the first one, I think in some ways the most intuitive version of reparations is what I call the harm repair view of reparations. So these are views of reparations that say what reparations is about is making the people that receive it better off. And the further questions from there is just who's on the hook for making those people better off. So one party gives money or land or voting power or something to a second party. And the welfare of the second party is how we know reparations has succeeded or failed. And there's a lot that gets right. I think it gets right the kind of ruthless realism that we need to have. We're not in the business of fighting for reparations to say we tried, right? Reparations needs to accomplish something, right? It needs to make meaningful consequences, and not meaningful consequences for just anybody, but for the people whose victimization inspires the need for reparations in the first place, right? So give Black people, give Indigenous people, land back, money, something, and evaluate how successful it is by how much better off they're made by that. I think that gets a lot right. One of the things you would worry about is the kind of thing that comes up in one of the epigraphs to the book's chapter, right? Are we integrating into a burning house, right? Are the transfers that you make of land or voting rights or money, are those durable? Are you going to make durable differences in people's lives, or are you just going to temporarily change an unjust system to a marginally less unjust system? So that's a thing I would worry about, and a thing that inspires the constructive view. The second view of reparations is the relationship repair view, which I'm less sympathetic to, but I'm still sympathetic to, right? Just in full disclosure, I guess. But the relationship repair view is, well, we want to heal the relationship maybe among the community of people receiving reparations, or maybe heal the relationship between the people giving the reparations and the people receiving it. So maybe this is how France heals its relationship with Haiti and Martinique, or maybe this is how white Americans and Black Americans, or settler Americans and Native Americans heal their relationships, or maybe it's the US government healing its relationship with African Americans. We could run it in different places for different groups. But the idea is it's a relationship rather than welfare that's supposed to be repaired. And I'm the most worried about this one because I feel like it's the most gameable. One day Nancy Pelosi will kneel with kente cloth, and then the next day she'll increase the police budget, and we're supposed to,
for example,
view that as a win somehow.
For example.
I've used that example so many times over the past year, and I never feel like I should stop, so I won't. So I am worried about the kind of potential cheapness of the symbolism. But I think, if you were serious about what relationship repair means to you, such that, healthy relationships between people involve something like political parity, maybe you're a Republican political theorist and you think we have a bad relationship already if you even could dominate me, right? If we live in a system that would allow you to control my life, we have already right now a bad relationship, even if you don't make use of that opportunity. So if that was the kind of holistic thing you meant by relationship repair, then I think that would be I would be a lot less worried about that version of relationship repair. And it would be a lot more like the view that I go for, which is the constructive view, the third of the three. And that's the view that we should create the just world. We should create a just system, and that the people and institutions most on the hook for that construction project, who have to pay most of the costs of that, are those who have gotten most of the benefits from yesterday's injustice. Right. So a good, easy parallel to get the juices of that thought flowing, or, what's climate politics, right? What's the polluter pay principle? right? Well, we understand that it is a problem for everyone that the planet is getting warmer. We understand that not everyone relates in the same way to that problem. And so we charge the most for that project we're all interested in of keeping the planet habitable to the people who have the most to do with the problem. And that would be the big oil companies, something like that, right? And I use that example for one, because I'm explicitly trying to tie climate politics to this history. Two, because I think it's a clear example. But also three, because I think it actually shows more or less the kind of thing that I am trying to generalize. If we in general thought that pollution, inequality, vulnerability to abuse and oppression are things that don't spring out of the ether, but as we were talking about before, are historical consequences of previous actions. And we thought those actions were identifiable and that we can track the wealth and power that accumulates as a result of the actions that created those injustices. We would be doing something that's actually quite like the thing that we do when we track pollution, right? We would be tracking where bad things have accumulated based on the complex, dynamic, but understandable interaction between large-scale economic production, large-scale economic consumption, and its results for our social system. And if we do that with institutions that are causing the accumulation of debt in the global South and causing the accumulation of public health problems in disadvantaged communities, we will be doing a version of accounting, much like the accounting we do when we track pollution. And spoiler alert, we will find very much the same list of people, the same list of institutions as a result of both of those kinds of investigations. Obviously, the overlap will not be perfect, but there will be overlap.
You have already, underscored the inextricability of climate justice to your argument, right? It's woven throughout the whole book. And it's interesting. At some point, you're like, these aren't necessarily related projects. They're related in the world that we live in now, right? Like, I think it's really important to stress that. But that it is not baked into the concept of reparations. But it is woven throughout this book, and it also emerges really powerfully in the context of this invocation of thinking in terms of our ancestors and as an ancestor. And, I think this is sort of where we started, is that thinking about the violence and the scale, just the sheer scale of climate change is so daunting that it can feel, paralyzing or disempowering. But as you say, and now I'm quoting, the ancestor perspective helps ground a kind of revolutionary patience while at the same time rejecting complacency, close quote. So can you talk about what this means about the ancestor perspective and about the horizons that thinking in these terms opens up for you?
One thing I often find myself reminding people of, especially my students when I teach about these issues, is how recently the world has changed at scale. Right? My parents were born colonial subjects of the British Empire. My siblings and I are the first born after that. And what it took to end formal colonialism on the African continent, I think, couldn't have been accomplished by the sort of people that gave thought solely or perhaps even primarily to the changes that they would see in their lifetime only. I think when we look back at successful historical movements, we get a sense of what it takes to make change and solidify that at the scale of even one social system the size of a state, right? It took decades to fully prosecute and transition from the Haitian Revolution to the post-revolutionary state and nation. It took decades, centuries, depending on how you count, to win the fights for abolition of slavery that raged throughout the 19th century. And the people engaging in those fights had to win extended institutional and ideological battles that went across people's lifetimes necessarily, whose consequences I think are still yet to be fully realized, even in ours, right? But they didn't not accomplish things, right? Every example I just gave was an example smaller than the scale of total planetary revolution, but that was nevertheless made identifiable, real changes that were worth making and worth fighting for. The Haitian revolutionaries eradicated slavery from one half of one island. That was worth doing, right? The people that won the national independence struggles in Asia and Africa in the 20th century didn't win a totally remade new international economic order as they had hoped, but they chased various regimes out of their capitals. They constrained the worst forms of colonial excess in ways that were worth doing. And if you're going to get the stuff in the middle, right, if you're going to get the stuff on the scale of a national revolution, if you're going to get the stuff on the scale of a national independence wave, if you're going to get the stuff of a 40-hour work week, of weekends off, if you're going to get the stuff of fucking dental, you have to have the scale of patience that it takes to fight the bigger fight, because you don't get the small wins without the level of investment of being all in that makes the big wins that we're all fighting for part of things. So the revolutionary patience that I'm talking about isn't just saying things are going to suck in your life and they'll never get any better. You'll never accomplish anything, but maybe your grandkids will have fun, right? It's saying we need this horizon to orient ourselves to, not so that we give up on the prospect of achieving things on the scale of a lifetime, but so that we become the kind of people that could achieve things on the scale of our lifetime. And, that's the closest thing I have to hope in the face of the scale of the challenge we're up against.
I loved those sections of the book in a very particular way for so many reasons, not least of which that I think just your prose is beautiful in these sections. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a bit to give a sample to our audience, and then I want to say something else. But the questions history asks of us are not the sort that we can answer with our ancestors' achievements, moral legacy, or suffering, as extraordinary and important as they might be. We can only answer them with our own actions, our own politics. I share the complex legacy of my ancestors with those in my immediate ethnic community who struggle for justice, with those who abuse their children and intimate partners, and with those who do both. What my ancestry adds to the moral character of our decisions is poorly treated as a moral inheritance and better described as a relationship of intergenerational mutual responsibility. We should think about our ancestors, but we will win and lose our own ethical battles based on what we do for our descendants. We are defined by the kind of ancestors we choose to be. I got tingles reading it. I'm getting them now. What really strikes me about this, among many things, is first, I think for those in the audience who have psychoanalytic sympathies or are thinking in those terms, this feels like it captures in a way that is embedded in with the political and other consciousness, like material social realities that the rest of the book establishes, what's best in sometimes some of the political uses of like a thinker like Melanie Klein, or these accounts of how we move, just glossing it broadly for the audience sake more than anyone else, how we move from positions of like thinking we are like the only subject in the world, like this sort of baby who is like, His Majesty is what we'll call it, to realizing, we actually came literally from another human being, right? But also that other human being is a human being like me too. And then we develop successively more integrated consciousness of both ourselves and others through a series of positions that are somewhat idiosyncratically talked about in terms of depression, reparation, love, etc. But in any event, it's sort of a process, and here I think of the epigraph we opened with, of becoming more human, right? Or
more human humans.
More human, right? Or becoming more fully human. And possibly there's a connection here we could draw to sort of Fanon's vision of humanism. But what I also loved about that, and the pages surrounding that bit that I just read, is that it clarifies and cuts through the different types of responses that talk of reparations activates in many different directions. And I can think about those maybe as having sort of two primary modes, which also ramify in terms of other things we've been talking about, namely this kind of immediate sort of very simplistic kind of rejection or disavowal, right? Which is like, what do you mean? I never owned slaves. And it's like, incidentally, that's just a bonkers thing to say. Like, first, if I would hope not, but also like, if that's your bar, like, Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah.
To which again, I think bespeaks a whole series of identifications and disidentifications and with the people who came before you. And also, as you say in the book, it doesn't really matter as much, or rather the question of what our ancestors did or didn't is subordinate to the question of what we do now, and which of the ancestors we choose to understand as having lessons to teach us or give us, pathways that can inspire us or variously move us forward. And then the second thing I think you sometimes get is a pivot to abstraction, which also I think has a kind of aspect of being like a moral, hygienic kind of operation, but also of disavowing certain types of anxieties, which is namely, let's make this about, policy white papers, or in any event, well, exactly which institutions are going to do this. And I think, without dragging Rawls out again to continue wailing on him, I think there arguably is something in the Rawlsian gesture there too, where it's like, okay, we're going to, I put it even rhetorically, like, what is that account of the original position as we've described it, if not a disavowal of the fact that you have ancestors and that you are going to be the ancestor to other people, whether or not you reproduce, right? But there's this idea that like you have people behind you and people ahead of you.
Yeah.
And what the gesture seems to offer is like, well, you can disavow your ancestors or not think about them by going into the original position. And you don't really have to worry about what other people are going to do, because they can just, down the line, because they can just go to the original position too, right? It kind of produces this ratification, ultimately, of the inertia of where things are going. And that only will lead to hyperintensification of what you've described, right? A world in which, I don't know, like we have satellite labs that are manufacturing erectile dysfunction pills in space, but kids in Uganda don't get glasses. Like that type of shit.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess, just to tie it up with a bow, what I love about this notion of ancestry here is that it's both particular but also portable, and I think has a kind of appeal that feels to me like universal in the best possible way, insofar as that it opens up possibilities for new identification, and it allows us to think about ourselves in a way that does meet us where we are and open up new possibilities for where we could go, without forcing us to either take flight into abstraction or just sort of marinate in guilt or disavowal. In other words, I think it really makes the question it brings us back to these questions of like identification, disidentification, but in terms of like, what are we the subject of, right? Who are we, rather the sort of continually sovereign individuals who don't have to exist in relation to others, or are we existing it's merely as the objects or outputs of processes? But rather, it seems to say, well, the answer is a bit of like, we are all subjects together existing in these brief periods of time. And rather than just being like, well, I don't know, be the change you want to see in the world, which I guess is a misquoting of Gandhi, and I don't even know what that means. And oftentimes just means don't do any change unless you get to see it all personally. It's do something that's real where you are. And that in and of itself is a necessary and vital precondition to opening up and making things that can go forward.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of not letting Femi get a word in edgewise for a minute here, because we're admiring this chapter, one could kind of like rush through this idea of like the ancestor perspective and think of it as primarily a turn to the past. And I think it's really important that there is that turn to the past. You insist, in fact, in the book that we never stop that. But it is also about the conceiving of the self as not just a future ancestor, but an ancestor in the making while one is living. And it allows you to toggle in between not just past, but present and future in the face of climate crisis in this way that, to me, I'm thinking about like two perspectives that I find like superlatively unhelpful. So one is like entirely present focused. The whole world is burning, YOLO. Like, let's just like, kind of have fun while the world burns, right? Like, because I'm going to be dead before, well, probably I won't, but you know what I mean? And the other one is like this very Silicon Valley-y effective altruism, long-termism stuff, where the future and people of the future, and this is also, rests on some of these sort of utilitarian ideas where it's about like the number of people compared. It evacuates the meaning and experience and future legacies of the present while kind of kicking the can down the road in certain ways. And so like the down the road is always the important part. And thus you can neglect the here and now, right? And so both of those I find so profoundly unsatisfying. And I say this also as like a person, I don't have, Patrick and I don't have children, right? We're not going to be, I mean, we have nieces and nephews, I suppose there's like I think it's important that like the kinship metaphor is a metaphor and it's literal, but like everyone is implicated in this idea. But it has this way, I think, of revitalizing in a moment when, as we have said a number of times, hope is in short supply, of revitalizing kind of small but meaningful individual and, most importantly, collective work. So yeah, I found it to be really, I got to the end of the book and I was like, it's daunting. I always feel it, and I say this as somebody who is a philosopher who has a historian in the family. Like there's only two disciplines in the humanities now that ever like think that we might still be the master discipline, right? It's either history or it's philosophy, and obviously like none of those things are true, right? And none of us have the sort of influence that that might imply also. But there is this way sometimes, and we've poked at Rawls and we've poked at abstraction, but I think that what this book being written by you as a philosopher rather than a historian also, while it marshals like an enormous amount of historical analysis and information, the abstraction is in the relationship to time. And that is not an abstraction that is smuggling things in the way that the sort of like, Rawlsian project is. It's an abstraction that is like that lives like right here. It lives like with every like passing moment of like the ticking of the clock for all of us.
And, hopefully it's an abstraction that, let's say, invites one to actually see and own up to what they're doing rather than an abstraction that invites one not to. And that is how I see the Rawlsian project. Maybe less so the actual project itself so much as the lack of a complementary project to relate the Rawls to the actual historical circumstances we find ourselves in, right? I think that would be a whole theoretical undertaking of its own. But, the question isn't how might one operate in a fair system. The question is, how do we operate in these ones that differ along various dimensions, and how do we account for those differences in the things that we do, right? In the choices we make or fail to make. And, the interesting thing about the sort of long-termist perspective is, on the one hand, it is a radical acceptance of at least the time-bound relationship of our decisions to other contexts. But it is one that often seems allergic to the truth about those relata, which is, our relationships to other time periods aren't relationships between numbers of utils and our decisions. They are relationships to people and our decisions, right? That's why I go for the ancestor descendant language. The people that come in the future will not simply realize the goods of the investments we're making today, but will themselves be decision makers, will be people, are people from a perspective that we already, have relationships to in some sense, right? That's what the ancestor model is. That's what, indigenous 7 generations models of thought have long been affirming. Like this is a way of thinking about how we are related, not to just the abstracted consequences of things, but how we are related to people that live the consequences of what we do and don't do. And, there's a lot that's scary about that. We don't control those future people. Those future people can succeed or fail to live up to what was good about what we're doing. Those future people could remember what was bad about what we're doing, right? There's a lot that we give up by looking at those future people as people, but there's a lot that we gain as well, which is they may make something true in the future about what we're doing now that we can't. They may win the last fight that means that that makes it true that today we're in the process of winning the war. And so it's not all doom and gloom, right? I think we get something out of acknowledging that the future descendants, the people who come after us, whether there are genealogical descendants or whether they're simply the people that come after us, there's something in it for us to acknowledge our relationship to them and our vulnerability to them, and their vulnerability to us.
Thank you so much. This has been such a generative conversation. Femi, before we go, other than my suggesting to our listeners that they buy the book, which I do, in fact, strongly suggest, and it will be in the show notes, are there other things, other writing, places people can read you, see you, find you on the internet? If you want to be found.
Google Scholar. Maybe one day. Maybe one day I'll have another paper out.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for writing this book and for all the writing you do. It's magnificent stuff, and we really appreciate the time you spent with us, truly.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is made possible entirely by the support of our Patreon community, which also keeps it ad-free for everyone. If you'd like to support the show and get 2 additional episodes per month, including our journey through Freud's Standard Edition, come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Olúfẹ Táíwò. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.